You seem to think that we're very lazy in the West.
I don't think I see.
You know.
I know.
Do you see this as the besetting sin of Western industrial civilization, that people don't work hard enough?
They don't work hard enough. You talk too much about your so-called democracy, accusing other people of not being democratic. You write too much and you work not enough.
The relations on the whole were very cordial, very friendly, and very good. This is, of course, on the government-to-government basis. But, of course, there was another side to this whole relationship, and that was represented by sectors of the press. And, of course, there was the almighty BBC. To the Shah's mind, it was hypercritical, it was tendentious, and it lacked objectivity.
The World Service in particular became a source of friction.
The BBC, I think, was really quite popular because it broadcast news which Radio Iran wouldn't, and therefore it had far greater credibility.
The relation between Iranian listeners and BBC Persian service has been some sort of love-hate relationship. They expected foreign radio broadcasts to reflect what they felt was the truth.
The BBC covered the discontent extensively on both radio and television. The Shah told his ambassador to take action.
The Shah essentially wanted to suppress the BBC, particularly the BBC Persian services.
I remember only too well the endless representations I got from the Iranian ambassador. Now, on this issue, I was very tough.
David Owen, of course, for whom I had a great deal of sympathy, and do still, though I haven't seen him for a very long time, said that I agree with every word that you say, Foreign Minister, but the BBC is independent and there's nothing I can do about it.
I explained to him time after time that though the Foreign Office, on its budget, funded part of the British overseas broadcasting, we did not control their policy.
Hearing this from the Foreign Secretary was sufficient for Iran's ambassador, and he sent a telegram back to Iran.
By the standards of those days and my position in London, even though I say it myself, I think it was rather an audacious telegram, in which I said that we would be better advised to simply ignore the contents of foreign broadcasts as far as the Iranian regime is concerned, and that if the fate of the Iranian monarchy depends on a 5-minute or a 10-minute commentary by the BBC, we might as well pack up our bags and go.
One man provoked particular passion on both sides.
They were very unhappy about our even mentioning the name of Khomeini when he was in France. The reporting of what he said, and we had to report what he said, of course, in reaction to events in Iran. The reporting of what he said was strongly resented in Tehran, very strongly. But inevitably we had to report it. It was part of the general picture.
The BBC, of course, maintained, I think the phrase that they used was that in the political equation of Iran, the Ayatollah Khomeini was then a valid player.
He was a very prominent figure, and what he said constituted news and had to be broadcast.
It was inconceivable for the Shah, and for that matter for the great majority of the Iranian people, to accept the fact that you could have the broadcasting authority of a government who was broadcasting views not necessarily in accord with the views of the government of the day.
The Iranian radio and television went on a strike for some time, and that gave even more prominence to Persian broadcasts from the BBC.
The strike became the subject of a famous Iranian cartoon.
The stakes were enormously high. It was a question of the Shah's, the survival of his regime.
I could do something, and he knew I could do something. I could have interfered with the BBC. I hoped the BBC would have sent me packing and told me to mind my own business, and I believe that they would have done.
David Owen was very critical of us, actually, largely because he saw things through his own perspective and found the rows which occasionally erupted difficult to cope with, and therefore he took it out on us. And I remember one particular occasion when there was a lunch at Bush House of the Board of Governors, at which David Owen was present, at which he let fly, and I had to defend myself.
Well, that's absolute nonsense, and I'd like to have evidence of that. I mean, firstly, I don't think I've ever met Mr. Mansell. So that's the first thing. If Foreign Secretary was going to interfere, I don't frankly think I would interfere at that level. I would have interfered with the chairman of the BBC, and I never did.
The policy of the Foreign Office was to be blindly supportive of the Shah. We couldn't do that. We had to reflect all shades of opinion, which we did. And that provoked a certain amount of reaction on the part of senior people in the Foreign Office who resented what we were doing. So we had a number of lunches at Bush House at which senior people from the Foreign Office came and delivered their messages and were very largely ignored.
By the end of 1978, Iran was in chaos, with the majority of people against the Shah. Hundreds had been killed in demonstrations, but the Shah was losing control.
I believed by then that, well, certainly by December, that the game was up and that he was almost certainly going to go, and the only people who could make that choice and handle the situation were the Iranians themselves.
The Shah fled Iran, and Ayatollah Khomeini returned to take power. Britain and Iran's relations entered a new phase of almost complete estrangement. The Shah would always blame the British for Khomeini's rise to power.
He was always suspicious of the British, and I think, to begin with some justification. You must remember that he'd seen at the age of 6 that his father had been put on the throne of Iran by the British. At the age of 21, he'd witnessed his father's removal from the throne of Iran by the British. And of course, in 1953, the British had collaborated with the Americans in removing Mossadegh from office. So he was keen to attribute to the British and the Americans, to the Western powers, if you wish, magical powers that simply didn't exist. The events within Iran